right about the time that I was stepping on the stage in Syracuse. They didn't decide it for that reason. They couldn't care less about my plans, but that was the moment of execution. Now, keep in mind, the Supreme Court could have decided to look at the evidence in this case like any time in the last 20 freaking years, right? I mean, they've had time. They could have done it, forget the last 20 years, like the last 20 days, the last 24 hours. But no. They waited until they had brought this man and his family, and the family of the murdered officer, for that matter, into the death chamber to witness his execution. They said, oh, wait, we're done with our dinner. Maybe we should look at this. And maybe a few of the justices really read the information. I doubt very seriously that a couple of them did. I'm pretty confident Justice Scalia did not. And here's why I can say that without fear of contradiction. This is a man, among those who reviewed this case last night, who is on record at least once saying that there is nothing inherently unconstitutional about the execution of an innocent person. That's his official judicial opinion and his official moral pronouncement, that there is nothing unconstitutional in the eyes of the historical jurisprudence of this country that says that there's anything really inherently unconstitutional about doing that. Now, that will lead you to conclude one of two things. Either that Antonin Scalia is a blithering idiot who has no moral claim on the seat he holds, or, and this is more frightening, a possibility, or he's not an idiot, and he's telling you something about your culture, your country, and the Constitution that might be frighteningly true. See, maybe he knows more about it than we do. Maybe when he says that, as immoral and unethical as it may sound, maybe he's right that actually this country hasn't ever said that due process means anything. Like, it's just this vague concept. We can throw it around, we can teach it in school, we can put it in the Constitution, right there in the Bill of Rights, but it's not really given any legs, it's not given any meat, they're just these empty bones. And so what Justice Scalia is saying, we don't mean it, and we never have. Surprise. I'd like to just put it on him and say that it's his flaw, but actually I'm more inclined to believe that he's got it exactly right, given the history of the Supreme Court. This is a Supreme Court which said, you know, not all that long ago, that black folks had no rights which men were bound to respect. Those were also the brightest jurists of their time. And what's interesting, that wasn't just their own bias. Like, that was what the Constitution actually said. They actually did know the law. The fact that the law had nothing to do with morality, the fact that the law had nothing to do with justice is sort of beside the point. They were right about what the law said, but that tells you there's something deeply poisonous and rotten about the culture that needs to be changed. And it's not just the individuals who sit on the Supreme Court who sometimes give us these strange, if inadvertent, and totally unintentional insights into the system that they think is just fine. See, I'm sure he didn't mean it as a critique. The Constitution doesn't prohibit the execution of innocent people, and Justice Scalia is just fine with that. That doesn't present any moral qualms for him. Right? Because he's all right with it. I mean it as a critique. I hope you think of it as a critique. He thinks of it as praise for the system. Just one more beautiful thing about America. But that's not the only evidence of the culture of indifference to pain and suffering. Just a couple of weeks ago now, I guess it was, maybe not even 2 weeks ago, at one of the Republican debates, you know, this big cheer goes up. Thousands of people in the room, and hundreds of them at least, cheering when Rick Perry, governor of Texas, made sure that everyone knows about his biggest accomplishment. In his own mind now, this isn't me trying to put this on him, he's very proud of this, that he's overseeing the execution of, 200 and some odd people in the state of Texas, and there's this big whoop and cheer, as if that somehow suggested he had some unique qualification to be president because he happens to be a governor of the state that's killed a couple hundred people. Even if I accept that each one of those people has actually been guilty of the crime for which they were charged, and I'm not so naive as to believe that. But I'm willing to grant that most of them were, probably the vast majority, maybe nearly all. Even still, the idea that we would cheer at the death of people, see, that tells you something about your culture. It's one thing to support capital punishment, but to actually need to cheer it, to actually show up at a debate and cheer blood and death is a sickness. And to show up outside of prison, show up outside of prison, as happens every time a person is executed in this country, in any state, not just Georgia, right, but my home state of Tennessee, anywhere. someone is put to death, there's always people who show up. Right? There are people praying, there's people mourning, there's people who are just there to witness, and there are people who are popping cold beers party to them. And there's something deeply wrong in a society where people are not satisfied to have capital punishment. That's its own issue. That's big enough for me, and probably for many of you, but that isn't it. That's not enough. Like, it isn't enough that we take the life. We have to do it in a celebratory mood, in some, like, gladiator, like the Colosseum of old. You know, we have to make it into a party. That's a very different thing. That's about indifference to pain. That's not about respecting the sanctity of human life. If you respect the sanctity of human life, you don't celebrate the death of anyone. And this isn't just something that we need to think about with regard to capital punishment, frankly. The best example of it in modern times is when folks thought, just a few months ago, it was appropriate to spill into the streets with American flags and signs and raise a cheer at the death of Osama bin Laden, because it wasn't enough that he was dead. You know, we had to treat it like it was a football game. We had to treat it like it was a pep rally, like it was the Olympics, people pouring into the streets. USA! USA! Not even thinking for 1 second, apparently, about the thousands of Americans and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and Afghan people, most of them innocent civilians who have done nothing to anyone, who had to die to get that one man so that we could have a party in the streets of Washington and the streets of New York City. And me saying that is not indifference to the pain of those who died on that day. It is to say that if we believe that those lives are more valuable than the 100,000 or so that we have snuffed by our actions, and we have a moral miscalibration that we need to address. I mean, unless you believe that you did something in a previous life to justify getting born here, USA, 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 as opposed to getting born there. See, I had to explain this to my kids a couple weeks ago on 9/11. I had to have this conversation with my 8-year-old about what had happened, because, you know, she really didn't have a real clear sense of it. And we had to have that conversation. When you tell an 8-year-old about something like terrorism, you know, what they're thinking is, my God, is somebody going to attack our house? And that was, right? That's where my kid went with it. And I had to assure her that that wasn't going to happen, because, you know, my house is not really all that attractive a target for terrorists. But I knew as I told her that story, the sort of pain, right, that I felt, which was my ability to tell my daughter that is not something which any Afghan father or Iraqi father could tell his daughter or son or himself at any point in the last decade, because indeed he has absolutely no reason to believe that his house is safe when we send so-called smart missiles into villages and we call the resulting dead collateral damage. Oops, we're very sorry. We didn't mean to kill you. You wouldn't be dead but for our actions, but it was a mistake for which you shall not be compensated. But remember, we are liberating you. Remember, 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 he said. And we celebrate. It's one thing to believe that the war on terror, which is like an absurd formulation because you can't fight a war against a tactic. But it's one thing to support that. It's one thing to be glad about the passing of one of the great terrorists of the last half century. I don't mean great in a good sense. I mean great in the sense of prolific, you know, which bin Laden has been. It's one thing to be, like, relieved at his passing, or at least not to mourn it. It's quite another to treat it like it's a reason for a party. The other day during the GOP debate, somebody was